Washington lands an elite defensive tackle in 4-star TI Umu-Cais.
You are Locked On Huskies, your daily podcast on the Washington Huskies, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back into another edition of the Locked On Huskies podcast. I'm Roman Tomashoff. I'm the site editor with Huskies Wire. Thanks for making this your first watch or first listen of the day, as we are part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And I'm coming at you on this Saturday afternoon with a special bonus episode because Washington just landed a massive commitment from 4-star defensive tackle TI Umu-Cais. I'm recording this after just going and filling up at the Bite of Seattle, and I'm so excited to be here to talk about TI because this is a massive win for Washington's coaching staff. The 4-star prospect from Cherry Creek High School in Colorado is ranked as the number 1 player in the state. And this is a guy who he's ranked as the number 40 defensive lineman by 247 Sports. But when you go and you talk to some personnel people up and down the West Coast and really anywhere around the country, this is someone who the evaluations, the offers, he's got 31 offers according to 247. It all just really adds up as someone who is, again, from what I've been told, the best defensive tackle west of Texas in this class. And this is somebody who at 6'3", 307 pounds, I think has a real opportunity to play early. And this is something that I've been saying going back to when Washington first offered him in early January, when Ryan Walters took a trip out to Colorado to scout a couple of other players and wound up watching TI and was just blown away by what he brought to the table. And I'm so impressed with how Washington was able to seal the deal here, because before we even get into what he brings to the table, we need to look at this recruitment process. First of all, I didn't even get a chance to record this in advance because no one knew what was going on. His family did a wonderful job playing their cards close to the chest and really keeping everybody in the dark to this final 5 of Washington, UCLA, North Carolina, Colorado, and Oklahoma. This is a really strong group where it sounded like North Carolina made a push at the end. UCLA has taken a couple prospects from Washington in this cycle. You know, the evaluations might be a little different on UCLA's end compared to Washington's, but the optics are what they are. So I look at getting back at UCLA and getting a win over Bill Belichick in North Carolina, who seemed to be the other two that were pushing the hardest for his services. And this is something that is so massive, especially when you look at the rest of Washington's defensive class, where you do have a really strong cornerstone in 4-star edge rusher Derek Colman-Brusa and a really promising guy who's going to take a few years to develop in Tom Malu. This is the kind of player where, like I said, I think he's going to play a lot and play early, because at his size, you can already see what he can bring as a 2-gap kind of player. And then you just turn on the film and he's someone who wows you in every aspect of his game, where you watch the feet and you watch his hands and you think, okay, yeah, this is a really advanced sort of player who understands, because he's also a high-level offensive lineman. He plays on the interior of that offensive line. And I think that that's something that really does show up in his game, is he very clearly understands what offensive linemen want to do to counter him from all his time on that side of the ball. And that's helped him develop a really refined set of pass rush moves already, even as someone who's a rising high school senior. And that's something I'm really excited to see once he steps on the field in college, because as someone who I think will primarily act as a 2-gap run defender to start out his college career, as he continues to add weight and add strength in a college weight program, this is something where I really can see him developing into a true pocket just collapser, somebody who can really get after the quarterback from the interior of the defensive line, because he just has that size, that strength, the footwork, everything, and the intelligence as well. Everything you need to get after the quarterback and make an impact in the Big Ten, those are all things he brings to the table. So kudos to Jedd, Fisch, Jason Kaufusi, Matt Doherty, Marcus Griffin, this entire Washington coaching staff for getting this kid in the boat. Because again, this is somebody who, since he got offered in January, he looked like the kind of player who, in a massive, what was supposed to be a massive defensive line class for Washington, who really could be somebody who makes that sort of impact early. And I keep saying that because you look at who Washington is losing at the end of the 2025 season. It's not just Simone Pepa and Logan Sagapolu, 2 true nose tackles who TI will probably wind up replacing. It's a couple of guys where he's got the athleticism and the versatility to move around the defensive line if need be. It's Antario Thompson is out of eligibility. Taitai Uyunglele is out of eligibility as well. So there are several different places that you can see a guy like TI slotting in across this defensive line, especially in this Ryan Walters scheme, where it's not always going to be, just the traditional 3-4. There's that 5 down front. There are so many different things that he brings to the table. And a guy like TI allows you the versatility to do any sort of different things because you can move him a little bit further out. You can shade him out of that true 0 technique to a 2 or 3 and line up somebody like Derek Colman-Brusa, which is something he talked about with me on this show, where he can line up as a stand-up pass rusher. I was going to say outside linebacker, but when he's lining up right over the center, that's not really what the position is. He can line up over the middle of the defensive line and find ways to make an impact because it's all about creating matchups and just with your best pass rushers, trying to get them into advantageous one-on-one matchups with opposing offensive linemen. And this is the kind of guy who allows you to do that because if you need him to take up 2 blocks in run support, he's able to do that. He has that kind of strength and that physicality, that lower half, the feet that I keep referencing, that allows him to not just get moved off his spot the second the ball is snapped. He's someone who's able to just take up all that space and turn running backs into secondary gaps where maybe other defensive linemen are starting to break through while he's just occupying a double team. And these are all things that are so important. Just when you think about what the future holds in the Big Ten, where you look at some of the different offenses that Washington had to face last year, and when they faced the Iowas, the Indianas, the Penn States of the world, Oregon as well, where, I know that was just a different sense in terms of the game plan because they probably had a better passing offense than anybody else Washington saw last season. But you look at just the pure rushing attack that all of those schools brought to the table last year. Washington wasn't able to get pressure. They weren't able to hold their ground and run support. And a lot of that was due to depth issues at the position as well. But having high-end prospects like Umu-Cais, who already come in with such a high floor of, that you're getting someone who at the very least is going to be able to hold his ground and run support and do some of those different things that you'd ask for from a true nose tackle, a lot like what we're probably going to see from someone like Logan Sacapolo this season. But the fact that he also brings such high upside as a pass rusher as well are things that are so important to consider when factoring in this evaluation, factoring in, a potential late NIL push to try to get a player like this to sign, which is something that we're just seeing become a common occurrence in college football. And I'm sure had at least a little bit to do with Washington here, because this is the kind of guy who I was talking about it with a good friend of mine who's a wonderful source for me just in college football in general, who we were talking about it. And he was saying to me that this is the kind of player, no matter what your NIL evaluation of him is, you go above and beyond to try to secure this player because you look at the upside and you look at what he brings to the table and you say, yes, this is not only projectable in the Big Ten, but it's projectable for somebody who, usually goes on to succeed in the NFL. For someone in TI whose favorite player is Vita Vea, that just makes it all the more important and just a wonderful just set of circumstances for him to end up at Washington. And now I know the question that's on all you everydayers' minds out there is, what does this mean for the rest of the defensive line class? And we'll get to that right after a message from our good friends over at FanDuel. Summer sports are in full swing, and whether you're all about baseball under the lights like me, golf on the green, or high-stakes soccer action, FanDuel is the best way to make every game even more exciting. You're already following the action. Why not make it a little more thrilling? With FanDuel, you can get in on the game while your friends are getting sunburned at the beach, and that's great news for all you Husky fans out there who want to go take a look at their over-under this season. The win total right now is 7.5 on FanDuel. I would certainly recommend that over with the way this schedule shapes up for the Huskies, especially at home, plus all the young talent on this roster. Damon Williams, Jonah Coleman, Denzel Boston, Takario Davis, all the talent that Washington has at its disposal this season. I think 7.5 is a fantastic line, and I'm certainly going to be slamming that over on FanDuel. And if you're new to FanDuel, new customers can bet just $5 and get $150 in bonus bets if your first bet wins. Open the FanDuel app today or visit FanDuel.com to get started. All right, so as we take a look at just the rest of Washington's 2026 class, having a player like TI Umu-Cais does cover up a lot of shortcomings. We're having someone that just is this advanced and just understands the game at the high level that he does at this point in his career can cover up some issues. And it's something where when we point to the transfer portal at the end of the year, you probably don't have to take as many bodies along the defensive line as you might have expected if he, say, went to UCLA or North Carolina, because he does, again, have that opportunity to play early on in his career thanks to this massive heaping skill set that he brings to the table. But it doesn't cover up all the issues. And we look at it now, and I mentioned Derek Colman-Brusa and Tom Malu a little bit earlier. You've got another guy who can play early, and then another one who's going to take some time to develop. So as we kind of look out over the rest of this 2026 class, I want to make one thing very, very clear. Until I see a player decide to take an unofficial or an official visit to Washington this fall who may or may not be committed somewhere else, I am not going to talk about flips, because I don't think it's worth it in this day and age, because it's something that I know I mentioned on a show last week, as some of the everydayers know, that Brandon Huffman was talking about on 247 Sports, I believe, where he said that we're not going to see nearly as many flips this year because so many players are signing NIL deals when they commit. Players want to lock in whatever that, estimated revenue, whatever that offer is. They want to lock that in as soon as humanly possible. So I don't think that we're going to see nearly as many flips close to signing day as we might have in previous cycles. And, in a class where Washington is not necessarily hurting anymore, but still desperately looking to add several defensive linemen, that's not necessarily the best option. So I look at the rest of this 26 class, and maybe there is a diamond in the rough that Washington discovers. The only guy that I can reference in that light where it wouldn't be the similar recruitment, but just in terms of a late offer who Washington moved on quickly and was able to secure a commitment from, was Dominic Macon from the 2025 class, where being a state champion wrestler down in Oregon, who's got a high motor, got all the things you look for on the interior, if you're able to go and find a player of that caliber who, like Tom Malu, probably needs at least 2 years to develop before they see the field on a consistent basis, that's fine. You can stack your defensive line room with bodies that way on the back end, but you still need to find a way to add top tier contributing talent, which I do expect Washington to hit the transfer portal, not necessarily as hard as they did last year where they brought in 3 players, but maybe you're still bringing in a pair of guys, maybe even just one, depending on how some things work out. Injury-wise, to say these are the, veteran bodies that we want to make sure can be stopgaps before we let TI fully embrace a starting role, or Derek Colman-Brusa fully takes on a starting role, or something like that. And as I continue to look at it, I think we're going to be looking at least 2 more players that Washington is going to want to add from the high school ranks. One of them is going to be more of an interior defensive tackle. I don't know if it's going to be the true nose tackle projection like TI, but maybe somebody in that Tom Malu range, where somewhere between 280, 290 pounds, who has just a high motor, good athleticism, can find ways to push the pocket after some technical refinement, and an edge rusher who just is very toolsy, very traitsy, because that's what we saw from the outside linebacker edge rusher group that Washington brought in on official visits. I'm talking about Samu Moala, Tristan Givens, and Landon Barnes in that regard. So if we see Washington go after somebody like that who may not necessarily be highly rated, but you can see some of those traits, I wouldn't be surprised. And I think that's going to be the route through the transfer portal as well. At least one edge rusher and at least one interior defensive tackle sort of body. Now, that brings me to the last point that I wanted to hit on before I jump out of here today and let you all enjoy your weekend, and that's the 2027 class. Washington has done an okay job now in 2026, where things were not trending well, and adding TI Umu-Cais is a big enough buffer to at least grade this class out as average. You got 2 4-star prospects and a 3-star guy who really can be something with some development. But that doesn't mean that you can't continue to stack classes. And it's something I talked about on the show a couple of weeks ago. When you look at this 2027 class, there are plenty of high-end caliber bodies on the West Coast that we haven't seen in previous years. Elijah Harmon from Inglewood High School down in Southern California is a name that I like to throw out there as a high-end guy who it's going to be really hard to secure a player of that caliber. But that's somebody that Washington should certainly just in college football 26 terms, send the house after to try to secure a commitment from a player like that. But another player that I look at in the 2027 class is somebody much closer to home, and I think is already the number one priority on Washington's board in that class, and that's four-star defensive tackle Tevita Nonu from O'Day High School right here in Seattle. And I look at this class, and if Washington can make up for some of these deficiencies that we saw in the 26th class, where you're not adding the depth that you might have wanted in 2027, I think that's going to go a very long way towards not just Washington taking that next step in the Big Ten, but maybe if some of these players that Washington has missed out on in the 26th class don't pan out, it could also wind up as a real just feather in the cap of Washington's personnel department in terms of what they're doing from a talent evaluation standpoint and saying, we don't want to overextend ourselves in this case or that case, but if TI and Derek Colman-Brusa, they pop in this defensive scheme under Ryan Walters, I think that also is just another win, saying Washington is doing a really good job going after the players that they believe are going to succeed, and they'll let other teams come in and, quote unquote, overpay for somebody else that maybe they're not as high on the evaluation front. But we're going to have all of that and so much more on later podcasts. Thank you so much for being with me today on this Saturday afternoon. I really do appreciate it. And if you enjoy everything we're bringing to the table, please make sure you subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. That's YouTube, Spotify, Apple Music, Amazon Music. We're there. We're everywhere. We're updating this channel with new content every single day. So make sure you click that like button, click that little bell so you never miss when we post a new video. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, drop them right down below in the comments section. And if you're audio only, please give us a 5-star review, as it does help us out a lot. Thank you so much for tuning in, and we'll talk to you on Monday.